Yeah, today it's not that good news because the British national debt has exceeded the value of economic output for the first time in 62 years. At the end of May, public net debt was 100.1% of gross domestic product, so the GDP, as reported by the ONS Statistics Office in London on Wednesday. As things stand, it's the first time since 1961 that the round mark of 100% of GDP has been exceeded. In absolute terms, according to the ONS, the debt level was last at £2.567 trillion. However, the information should be treated with great caution. The statisticians expressly point out that the debt ratio now determined is based in part on growth figures estimated by the State Budget Office. This makes the debt ratio vulnerable to future revisions, usually down, in the worst, I mean. An example shows what it means. According to the Statistical Office, the debt ratio during the corona pandemic level in the summer of 2020 rose to a level similar to that of now. However, since economic output was raised afterwards, the debt ratio had to be corrected downward again. And the reason was the debt ratio indicates the ratio of debt to economic output. Therefore, if GDP increases, this leads to a lower debt ratio with constant debt, but not to a lower total amount. And the British Central Bank is continuing its fight against high inflation with a significant interest rate hike. The key interest rate in Great Britain increases significantly by another zero point 0.5 percentage points to a total of 5%. The Bank of England is driving the key interest rate to ever higher heights in the fight against inflation. And this 5%, as the central bank announced after its meeting in London now. Analysts had expected tightening, but mostly expected a smaller step of 0.25 points. And it's the 13th interest rate hike since the end of 2021. In Great Britain, monetary authorities are currently struggling with surprisingly persistently high inflation. As in April, consumer prices rose by 8.7% in May, and this is the highest value among Western industrialized nations. The increase also came as a surprise to experts, as bank economists had previously expected the inflation rate to fall to 8.4%. Contrary to the forecast for the Eurozone, experts are not assuming that inflation in Great Britain has already peaked. The head of the central bank, Bailey, recently warned that it will probably take much longer than expected to bring inflation under control. The so-called core inflation rate, which excludes fluctuating energy, food and tobacco prices, even rose in May. It climbed to 7.1% after falling to 6.8% in April. Preliminary stages have already followed, and the development of the money supply has lost momentum, as in the Eurozone, but the turnaround on the inflation front is still a long time coming. That was a judgment by Ulrich Wortberg from Helaba, looking at the inflation data published. Accordingly, experts were expecting interest rates to rise significantly as soon as the inflation data was published. After the surprising increase in the core inflation rate from 8.4% in April to 8.6% in May, a major interest rate hike was in the air. And the Bank of England is still behind the curve, and that's not falling. It's now running after inflation with strong increases in interest rate hikes. It's assumed that the end of the road is not yet in sight, and that the central bank is likely to raise key interest rates further in the coming months. However, interest rate hikes are always a balancing act for central banks. If interest rate hikes are too quickly, then there's a risk that the central bank completely chokes off the already weakening economy on the British Isles. The stubbornly high rate of inflation, which is still almost 9% in Great Britain, is a disgrace, especially for the Bank of England, which after 12 consecutive or now 13 rate hikes is still not much closer to its inflation target of 2%. Unlike in the EU and the US, the UK has not seen a U-turn for the better. And the central bankers now had no other choice, also because they initially reacted too hesitantly to the price jumps, and because they have been betting for too long that inflation will fall once the price pressure on the international energy and food market. The Patterson Institute for International Economics in Washington pointed out last year that the British have increased inflationary pressure due to Brexit and the associated trade barriers. In addition, inflation their purchasing power with high wage demands, and businesses pass the higher costs on to the consumers. That's a vicious circle that is created that can probably only be broken by a recession. The Brits are paying the bill for this monetary policy failure first and foremost. The 800,000 mortgage holders who will have to restructure the mortgages in the coming year will face an average cost increase of almost £3,000 per year. After the sharp increase in energy prices in winter and high food prices in the spring, this is the third shock for citizens. No wonder that even conservative parliamentarians are now demanding state aid from their government so as not to drive out the disappointed and embittered voters completely. So far, Chancellor of the Exchequer Jeremy Hunt has rejected such interventions because he fears, and rightly so, that they will fuel inflation further. Whether he will survive this is another question, though. Whether he can hold out politically is a completely different question here. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak took office to stabilize the kingdom economically after the chaotic days of his predecessor Liz Truss. Were in the ill-fated Truss days. And that's a no-confidence vote by the markets. Elections are set to take place in the UK next year, and the Tory government is way behind in the polls. An election campaign with a stagnant economy, high inflation rates, and depressing mortgage rates is almost impossible to win, and Britain's only choice is between, as we would say, plague and cholera. Experts speak of a ticking time bomb because property owners in Great Britain have to fear unaffordable costs due to rapidly rising interest rates for mortgages. And as this 13th consecutive hike was inevitable, the high inflation is still there because this move would mean higher payments for many homeowners now. And unlike in Germany, where real estate is usually financed with fixed interest rates of 10 or 15 years, interest rates in Great Britain are usually variable and are therefore closely based on the key interest rate. The tightening process from almost 0% at the end of 2021 to 5% currently is one of the harshest the British economy has ever had to endure. And the background is still the sharp increase in inflation, which is a lot due to the Russian war against Ukraine, but also to Brexit. And this has concrete consequences. According to a model calculation by the Resolution Foundation think tank, the mortgage payment for an average household that is rescheduling could increase by even £3,500 a year. And the increase will affect around 7.5 million households by 2026. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies warned that rate hikes could cost 1.4 million mortgage holders at least a fifth of their disposable income. And a YouGov poll for step change debt relief found that almost half of mortgage holders are already struggling with loan obligations and their bills. And the proportion of property owners who have to service a mortgage has fallen from 40 to 30% since 1989. Older people have paid off their mortgages, and for many younger people, the dream of owning their own home often fails because of the high costs. However, the desire for property among Britons is still widespread. As a rule, renting is only for a limited number of years, also because tenants have significantly fewer rights compared to Germany. And the prominent consumer advocate Martin Lewis called for political pressure on the banks. He explained to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak that banks are increasing their margins. That's what Lewis told ITV, for example, and he said that means they are increasing mortgage rates but not saving rates, so they make more money. Foundation expects an increase to 6% by mid-2024, and many people would have to turn their finances upside down for that. It's going to be a nightmare, Lewis said. However, consumers should not expect any extra help from the government, although it's called for. Sunak conceded that inflation was hitting families in particular, but he had already acted decidedly, as he says. And most recently, the Conservative government referred to existing aid, for example, with energy bills. The Prime Minister has promised to halve inflation, and he argues that government intervention will only push consumer prices further. The opposition Labour Party, on the other hand, accuses the Tories of economic vandalism. Well, it's a nice one. Owners are also concerned that house prices have recently fallen significantly. In April, a property cost on average £286,000. That was £7,000 less than at the high in September 22, and that was set by the ONS. According to a study by the German Economic Institute, real estate prices in Great Britain fluctuate much more than in Germany. The German housing market is resilient to sudden fluctuations in value. Conservative real estate financing with long fixed interest rates and high incidental purchase costs calm the market here. That was said by IW real estate expert Michael Vogtländer. German residential real estate is also more stable in value than in France and in the Netherlands. Because in Germany, the credit agreements with long fixed interest rates I mentioned earlier have so far prevented major defaults on real estate loans, especially in times of low interest rates up until last year. Many Germans secured attractive long-term credit terms, and this keeps the burden on borrowers low. According to analyses by the specialist publisher Argetra, the number of foreclosures in Germany has been falling for years, and expert warnings of rising numbers of fire sales have not come true so far. So we had a little something for our whataboutist friends here in the comments in the connection between Germany and Britain, and there's something on the inflation as well. Here in Germany, where I am living, the prices for milk and food are falling. They have not stopped to rise. They are falling in my supermarket. And in Britain, we have the highest inflation of all industrialized nations. And now start your whataboutism. That was a video with a little bit of accumulation of bad news. But if you're interested in more news on Brexit or other UK politics, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.